Okay, if we can go ahead and start. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming to this session on what if leaders fail to navigate cultural complexities. I'm going to be describing some research I've been working on over the last year or so. And there's some very specific things I'll be talking about in terms of specific cultures. And then I'll talk about some of the broader issues around managing a diverse team. This is research done with a couple of collaborators. My first PhD student ever, Kristen Bafar, who's now at Darden School in Virginia, and a PhD student she's working with, Kareem Janena. What we wanted to do was to better understand cultural differences in order to give better advice to managers in how to lead teams. So we oftentimes assemble groups with the idea, of course, that everybody brings their unique piece to the table and that we can all effectively share those perspectives and information, and that as a result, our diverse team is going to produce something more than a homogeneous team. Except there are lots of complications with that idea. It's a big idea, doesn't always work that way. So when you share information and different perspectives, it creates a degree of debate, conflict, difference of perspective, and different cultures react differently to that. And that's one of the issues we're looking at here in this study. And how do groups deal with this diversity of culture when you have a multinational team? Some cultures are more kind of easily adaptive to that than others. So those were the high-level questions where we started with this research. And I want to start here with this, just by way of an example of the idea here. So we'll need some microphones for this and a few of you to volunteer. What is the meaning of this picture? Anyone want to volunteer? All right, somebody, volunteered back there, yep.
Yeah, 6 fishes following striper fish.
Yes, thank you. Not a lot in terms of meaning there, but literally what it is. Somebody else want to chime in? There's somebody over here as well. And over here, yep.
Gabrielle Ivanhoe, I work for Rio Tinto. I think that it's that the leader is different from the followers.
So it's the leader out front, and they're special and a little bit different.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another interpretation? There's a hand up over here.
Hello, my name is Britt van Ooyen from Copenhagen. I think it might be an illustration of the independent versus the interdependent dimension of culture.
Okay. Interdependence versus interdependence. Okay. Good. Maybe one more, and then we've got somebody up in the front here.
He's got the leader as the head.
So leader is the head. Okay. Well, let me just tell you that this is actually from a research, several research studies have used this as a stimulus to get people to talk about what they think this is and what that means in terms of leadership. Depending upon where you are, it means different things. So to the Anglo-American manager, it is the leader out front who's a different, and the team is following the leader. Okay? But to a Japanese manager, the focus is on the team. It's a cohesive team who happens to be behind a single individual who may or may not have anything to do with the team. Okay? The focus is strictly on the people who are working together and look alike, in a more collectivist kind of a culture. On the other hand, if you're Singaporean, this is potentially kiasu. And kiasu is basically, don't let anybody get ahead of you. Okay? And in fact, this person here is not only not a leader, they may be actually disruptive and holding the group back, keeping people back behind them. Okay? On the other hand, if we're an Indian manager, we can talk about being able to ship a box of crabs without a cover. Okay? What that means is this. You can actually ship a box of crabs without a cover, because if you put them in the box and they start piling up and one starts to crawl to the top, you know what happens? They pull them down. Okay? So it's perfectly safe to ship a box of crabs without a cover. And is what's going to happen here, that group about to pull that one back into the fold and actually make them a part of the group because they're not being part of the group. Okay? And which is a very simple illustration of how culture affects the way we see what is objectively the same thing. You've got your 6 fish swimming along there, and you've got another one swimming in front of it that happens to look a bit different. Okay? So lots of different cultural meaning here. And this is an example, but there are quite a few others I can talk about here. One of which is there's some general principles that all teams need to achieve, but it works differently in different cultures. So, for example, trust between a leader and their team member is culturally important. It's important no matter what culture you're in. But of course, how you deal with trust is different across cultures. A more masculine culture is focused in terms of trust on things like what I would call behavioral integrity, which is, do I know what you're going to do next? Okay, I trust you means I can predict your behavior. As opposed to more feminine cultures where trust is benevolence. If I'm vulnerable to you, you take care of me. Okay? And there are national differences on this as well, whether you're inclined more to the trust means take care of me, or trust means I can predict, which means I don't need to like you. I don't even need to think you're a good person. I just need to know that where you're going next. Or another one, information exchange is essential to a team no matter where you are and who's on the team. But of course, this creates problems with debate, conflict, etc. This is one of the ones we started with. Particularly in a collectivist culture, that discussion or debate is potentially threatening to the relationships amongst the people in the team. And so if I'm from a more collectivist culture, what I see is the risk, and I don't necessarily see the benefits of information sharing. If I'm from a more individualistic culture, it's obvious that information sharing is good, but I may not see the problems that task conflict sometimes turns into relationship conflict, which is negative affect, I hate you. Okay, and that those have very strong correlation to each other. Successful teams need to take on board information from outside of the team. However, of course, critical feedback, potentially critical feedback, telling somebody perhaps they've done something not quite as well as they might have, or potentially wrong, is quite insulting in some cultures, to be direct and confrontative in that fashion. And successful teams also need to establish clear goals and rules and process early. But in a high-power distance culture, we expect the leader to provide this for us. This is what leadership is. In a low-power distance culture, we expect all of us as team members to do this collectively. So same thing needs to be done, but we're going to do it differently in different cultures depending upon those differences. And I'll talk a little bit about the specific studies in just a moment. But what I want to mention is that the basic view of diversity in most teams, if you ask most people who study this stuff, what they will tell you, they will oftentimes talk about what they call the double-edged sword of diversity. On the one hand, diversity gets you access to information and great potential for learning and better performance. On the other hand, we don't get along with each other very well. It's so easy to be misunderstood and have problems between us. So it's like having a double-edged sword. No matter where you move it, right, you're going to be cutting something, and it's not good. So it's a bit like the Game of Thrones, where you see treachery everywhere you go if you're a team leader in a team like this, because everything you do is going to offend someone. So what do? Okay? And what my colleagues and I want to do is to get away from this model of diversity, because we actually think it's not helpful. We actually think there are ways of getting around some of the potentially negative downsides of diversity without having to back off on information exchange. And we'll get there in just a few minutes as I explain how. So how do different cultures deal with these challenges? And as a leader of a multinational team, how do I achieve these imperatives when I've got different people who will interpret these differently at the same time? So specifically, I'm going to describe for you a study where we are looking, we went to 3 areas in the world because they're quite different culturally. And we were interviewing people, at least 25, usually 30, 35, 40 people, who are managing teams, Because although there's a fair bit of research out there on global differences between cultures, there's virtually nothing on managing teams in different cultures. There's some, not a lot, who have not worked outside that country, and we interview them in their native language. And this is really important because in our early work, we started interviewing people in English, assuming that if they're bilingual, that was just easier for us to do. And it turns out when you speak English, you manage a bit differently, even if it's in your home culture. So we actually needed to go back and interview people in Mandarin, in Arabic, as well as English. And I'll just describe briefly what we found, some of which is not a surprise, but let's just review it. So first, the Anglo countries, now the kind of gold standard most people use for cross-national comparisons is like, for example, the Hofstede arguments about or cultural differences. And I've got those here if you're not familiar with them. So the basic differences are, for example, about power distance. Do people accept that people at different levels have different levels of power? So I would expect that father has more power than children. I expect that boss has more power than me. That's just normal and natural. Versus low power distance, there's very little distinguishing between what I think or my position and others in terms of their power. And so as a junior person, I expect to be more involved. Individualism versus collectivism. So do I perceive us as each individual, or is my identity much more part of a culture of a group, a tribe, etc.? Third is about uncertainty avoidance. To what extent do I seek to get clear answers to things, or is a bit of ambiguity perfectly acceptable? Fourth, masculinity, femininity. Am I focused on, in masculine cultures, it's about being competitive between each other versus more feminine cultures where we all try to work together. And then finally, long or short-term orientation. So is our sense of history, 1,000 years, or what's going to happen tomorrow? Okay? So back to this one. So Anglo countries are high in individualism. We see people as individuals. Low power distance, we do not see big distinctions between level of people. Relatively low on uncertainty avoidance, so some degree of uncertainty is fine. And a relatively short-term perspective in things. Personal values that are most highly rated in these cultures are things like family, achievement, honesty, responsibility. Okay? From a team's point of view, we asked in each case for people to give us, what's your metaphor for a team here? And the metaphors most often used in Anglo cultures are mechanical. I'm running a team, it's like running a finely tuned machine. Somebody isn't working well, I take that person out, just like you take a part out of an engine, and I replace them with somebody that is working. It's the way I think about dealing with problems in my team. Okay? And you'll see that it's quite different in different places. So if we go now to China, in China it's low individualism, so high collectivism, high power distance, so both are quite different. Low uncertainty avoidance, okay, so okay with a degree of uncertainty, and a very long-term perspective. Personal values that are most cherished are things like family, success, guanxi, or personal connections, personal sacrifice for greater good. Now their metaphor looks it's more organic. It tends to be a grouping of animals, like a flock of birds, a herd of wildebeest, whatever it is. And here, if I now have a team problem, how do I deal with the problem with underperformance? What happens is I find a way to make it clear to that individual that they're holding the team back. When I do this, the honorable thing for that person to do is to withdraw from the team and say, you know what, I'm holding the team back, I'm going to withdraw, and then somebody else can come in. I don't necessarily force it in the same way I might if I were Western, but I find a way to make that message clear. And then if we now go to the Middle East, in some ways, and a lot of the Hofstede-oriented research suggests that China and the Middle East are quite similar. Because you'll see they're low on individualism, high on power distance, etc. But where we think they've got it a little bit wrong is they don't really take account of, for example, honor culture that exists in the Middle East. And by that, it's not only collectivist, but if I insult you, I insult your whole family, your whole tribe, your whole group. That membership is central to identity. And some of the values are a bit different. It's extended family, not just more immediate family. And the underestimate, I think, of the impact of Islam on the way people interact in that region. And in particular, the notion that a team leader needs to be like a father figure to the team. You take care of that team. It is your responsibility to take care of that team. And there's also a high degree of what I would call fatalism, or what's called fatalism, which is it's going to happen that way because God willed it. Okay? That's just the way it is. So much less willingness to challenge the way things are done. So their metaphors are, again, more organic, but they're holistic. So what you got are things like a metaphor of an octopus or the human body. And as a team leader, I am the brain. And the team leaders are, the various bits of the body. And if one of the bits of the body doesn't function properly, I have a team performance problem here, I do not chop it off. Okay? Now, my arm doesn't work very well, but I don't just get rid of it. Pretty much it's there to stay. So I can't tell it the honorable thing to do is to disconnect from the body, right? Either. That's not how that's not how people see it. So as a result, performance problems are tackled quite differently. I don't just take someone out. I get the best I can out of what I've got, is more the kind of the perception here, or the kind of way of thinking about team leadership. So I want to start putting some of these things together as an example of how we're thinking about multinational teams. So when leading a team in China, team leader needs to emphasize particularly the benefits of information exchange and ideas, because they're going to automatically understand the value in relationships. That is embedded in the culture. What they might not necessarily appreciate is that information exchange, although sometimes can lead to relationship difficulties, actually has important benefits in terms of working together. When leading a team and in the Arab world, motivation and context is the most important issue, because people are not generally able to replace. So you've got to do the best you can with what you have. And direct confrontation is also off the table, pretty much because honor culture basically disallows that from being a very direct way or engaging in a very direct form of engagement with them. So, putting things together. So when leading a group of multinational and multicultural team, remember that they have the potential, the information advantage is real and is well documented, that diversity, it can be highly positively correlated with performance if it's well managed. If it's not well managed, one of the most controversial findings ever done or ever published in my field was what's called a meta-analysis or summary of research on teams, showing that the relationship between performance and diversity in a team is 0. Okay, that on the whole, diversity doesn't automatically get us the benefits we think it does. However, what we actually really see is that the more diverse the team, the more diverse the performance outcomes. So on average, it may be 0, but the best teams in the distribution are highly diverse, well managed. The worst teams in the distribution are highly diverse, poorly managed. And then if you want to just kind of make it easy on yourself and get kind of average, so-so results, a homogeneous team will do that really well. And you don't have to work very hard at it. Okay? Of course, the reality, not only is it advantageous at level of business, but of course the reality is, whether we like it or not, we're dealing with more and more diverse teams. So, we're thinking, this is something we have to get our heads around. Because the diverse team can spiral down into this set of recriminations and problems. So let me give you an example. I've put on seats out here an article that I wrote recently showing that diversity in how you think about trust, which is has a strong cultural dimension to it, predicts that teams actually, most teams have a slow spiral downwards over the course of time. And it works like this. And you have differences, for example, much along the lines I started with. Some people, when they go into a group, assume from the start that most people are trustworthy, I want to work with them, and I'm looking for a good outcome here. Other people go into a team on the assumption that people are not always to be trusted, that one needs to keep very careful, close contact and attention to them. And so what you're looking for is, what are the tangible signals that I can actually trust that person? Versus, if you're on the other side, are there tangible signals I should not trust you because my instinct is to trust you? So the more diverse you are on that dimension, the more problems teams tend to have. And we've studied this in a whole variety of teams, and this gives you a nice little summary of what that research is all about. So here's some of the broad takeaways about leading in the multicultural team. First, shared team values and identity is critical. If you're working with a group from a single country or region, they already have a shared identity in whatever the identity of that region is and whatever the values of that area are. When you're working with a multinational team, what is the backdrop? What is the kind of shared cultural or values? And so sometimes, and this is one of the next ones coming up, you need to take a step back and decide. So one of the ways I like to think about this, for example, the worst mistake the Prime Minister of the UK can make is to attack the identity of any of the one of the constituent nations within. Okay, it's critically important that if you're Scottish and British. Not the notion that you would ever be British and not Scottish, okay, for example, is actually not a very good assumption to make. No matter how hard you try, you're never going to be able to squeeze the Scottish identity out of them. And the research on corporate mergers shows a very similar effect. In the idea of a merger, putting two companies together, we oftentimes say, like, we need a joint culture. So let's take the stronger identity and impose it on the weaker one and make them, that stronger identity. The chances of success in that are slim to none. The harder you try to crush that secondary identity, the harder it pushes back. So unless you're literally going to take everybody and push them out the door, it's unlikely to succeed. So what you have to do is to create a hybrid identity that blends them together. And that's what this is about. What's the identity this team has? Because identity issues are not obvious in a multinational team. You've got to start further back. That's what I mean about further back. What are identity? What are our goals? And you need to specify goals that are not only economic or performance-driven. You need to specify goals that are relationship-driven as well. If you aren't able to do that, the importance of the value certain cultures place on relationships then isn't recognized, and they're unlikely to be satisfied in the group. Cultural intelligence is critical, I think probably obviously in any of these teams. If you're not familiar with the idea of cultural intelligence, this is it. There are three components. One is the thinking component. Do I know what's different between cultures? Two, am I motivated, energized, excited to be in different cultures? And three, can I enact it? So, for example, do I know what to expect when I go to China? Do I care? Am I motivated to act? On behavior, can I actually enact the tones in the language that are required to be successful in the language if I'm going to be there in the long term? And so on. And particularly, motivation is hard to bootstrap. You can do a lot of work on the cognitive information side, and on the behavioral side, it's very difficult to have. If you're not motivated to make a multinational team work, it's very hard to do so. Coordination failure, and this is where we want to challenge existing thinking on diversity in particular. Coordination challenges are at the heart of a multinational team. Here's the argument of what we're going to say. That is, when people come together from different backgrounds, different identities, different nations, and they come together, inevitably, there's going to be a misunderstanding along the way. This is what happens. You think we're talking in inches, and I think we're talking in centimeters, or vice versa. Whatever it is, your cultural assumptions and my cultural assumptions aren't going to match at some point. And what we think happens at that stage is then, as soon as something goes wrong, we have a coordination failure. We then look for the people who are different from us and we blame them. So it's not that most people come into a team these days with kind of overt prejudice against a particular group. It's just that when problems arise, who do you blame? And we tend to blame the person who looks different or who sounds different. That's the place to intervene. Try not to go to the blame game when coordination failures happen. Assume you're going to have misunderstandings and you're going to have coordination failure. Assume problem solve them instead of blame. And that's actually a role that leaders can play quite actively in a multinational team. Pull people back from the tendency to be blaming. And of course, in any multinational team, everybody, especially a leader, has to be self-aware, understand how people react to them from different places and backgrounds, and be as open as you can be to try to deal with those problems. Right? So I want to open it up for questions now. I think we have a little bit of time, yeah? Yeah?
Thank you. I'm Andy Krasny from Deloitte. Does it work? Okay. I want to ask you about the very last thing that you said about feedback. Different cultures have also different expectations about feedback. So how do you make sure that everybody is providing honest feedback and also taking it the right way, constructively?
A great question about how do you make sure the feedback actually works in the way you'd hope it to work. And what I find in studies of multinational teams and senior leaders is very much what happens is initially people will give you a little bit of feedback. And the key is how the leader responds in that moment. Do they accept that or do they not accept it? Because what will end up happening is people will adapt to whatever the team leader sets as the norm. And this is where leadership matters critically. If a leader says, yes, I'm open to that, and we can learn from that and things genuinely change, people from almost pretty much any culture will gradually, more and more, and you can draw that out of people. Even if I'm born and raised in the United States, where you should expect feedback every day of the week, right? If I'm working with a team leader who very quickly is obviously not open to feedback, even I'm going to start shutting down and not doing feedback. So very much about leader signaling, in particularly early on. That's why this whatever your shared culture is, because you're always going to be whatever that culture is. Can you create this unique hybrid culture that brings all of us together? And feedback should be a central part of that. A couple hands. Yeah, simple. Where?
Hello there. I'm Katie Rapson. I'm a master's student of global leadership at Goldsmiths College. I was just wondering whether in your work you've seen whether organisational or corporate culture that can be embedded into teams has an effect on how differently different cultures come together. So whether the overarching corporate culture has an effect at all.
Yeah, of course, the overall corporate culture also has an effect on these things, but I will say, I think my reading of what the research says is that people quit bosses, not companies. So team leadership, in my view, is really at the heart of where successful management does or doesn't happen. Corporate culture is important. In fact, there is good evidence for that. They create the right context that makes it more likely a team leader can succeed. But this is why we think it's so important to get in at the team leadership level where we are studying, because we actually think that's where people's immediate decisions around turnover really happen. Yeah, we had a hand here and another one here.
Hi, Alison Hay Davis. I'm a Sloan Fellow. I was interested in your point on coordination and the tendency to pick people out for being different, because the other piece of research is the one about time and distance as being the hardest barrier to manage over as against cultural difference. So how do you square your findings with that one that says the hardest thing to manage is a time gap?
I personally think that time is very much related to this idea. For me, the core idea is we bring people together to create something, and of course it's harder to bring people together across time, and managing the virtual team, right, incredibly difficult. And if we look, I think you can look at diversity that way. We can look at it as multinational diversity, etc. But you're absolutely right. If we've got a team that's mostly in the room and a few that aren't, the one who's different is the one who's not in the room, oftentimes. So that's the link I would see, is that, of course, then they get the blame when the coordination failure happens. Of course, they weren't paying attention, they weren't doing, and so on, when, in fact, it's not at all clear. And there's some really good anecdotes I could share with you from our research about how people in these kind of virtual teams make assumptions then. So two teams working, one over here and one over here. This one gives long advance notice that there's a national holiday on this date, and this one schedules the meeting anyway, and then complains that this one doesn't, isn't in attendance and missed this important meeting. So then that's immediately the start of this kind of blame game for me. But the key for me is, how can you make coordination failures feel normal and as a cue for problem solving rather than blaming? Because I've also shown repeatedly in research that the best performing teams start off in the middle of the distribution in terms of their initial performance. They get some kind of slightly negative feedback, and they learn to do this they learn to work together to solve problems. The ones who start off at the top become a little too complacent and gradually kind of sink back. And the ones who start in the middle and to the bottom, when they get negative feedback, the worst performing ones also start in the middle and drop off because they blame each other. Again, it's this kind of, how do I stop the process of people blaming each other rather than problem solving together in a team? And that's the point at which I think you can intervene, and a lot of the problems that people see with diverse teams can be stopped. And there's some really cool research in the last few years showing that if you intervene at that level early, you can stop a lot of the kind of what we think of as typical problems in managing diverse teams. I know there was another question or two up here.
My name's Lucy. There are lots of different drivers of diversity, and a couple that we've talked about are nation state and gender, male, female. Which of those two do you think is more powerful? Are you able to say, or is there a third one that you think is an even more powerful driver of diversity?
All right, a great question about what drives these effects. And I'll tell you what I think is happening, and I hope hopefully it won't offend too many people. Many of the effects we see in diversity research are driven by what I would call deep-level diversity, genuine difference in value, styles, how we see the world, etc., rather than the obvious things we see on the surface. So, and gender and race and nationality are oftentimes strongly correlated. So we think they're driven by the differences in the way we look, but in fact, it's really about the underlying stuff. And in fact, of course, there is a direct connection, because if you are a different color or a different gender, your experience of the world will be different. And it's those differences in values and perspective that really drive most of the positive effects we see. And it's the surface level stuff that we see that many people blame for creating the kind of social categorization problems of, I don't like you because you're different. I won't listen to you because you're different. You look different, etc. We think we can actually find ways to dig a little deeper and focus on the deep level diversity, because that's where we think the action is actually happening. But they're correlated.
Hi, yes, I'm Michael. I'm a MBA and a 15 student. My question is around how do you encourage behaviors which improves performance? Apart from the tendency to blame, are there any signs that you can spot earlier? And what are the interventions that you would recommend? And I ask this because I work for a company which has got 110 people, over 9 offices around the world, and at least 27 nationalities.
Again, another great question. For me, I think the other component is this cultural intelligence component, and in particular the motivation. It's the point at which people lose the motivation to engage the exciting stuff that is around them, that people, I think, lose the ability to learn with others or from others. So if we I think we get a little too blasé about, or they get blasé about, diversity. Really, diversity always has the potential to be great and positive, but you know what? It's hard, and it's hard work if you're really going to do it, and it's really motivation driven. Do I really want to learn from these people who are different? Do I really want to understand their perspective? So for me, the other thing to really pay attention to is how motivated is the person sitting across the table from me to really engage with the difficulties that diversity brings. Because if they're engaged with it and they're not blaming the people who look different, I think you've probably got as good a shot as you can have at doing it or doing something constructive with it. For me, those are the two ones. I'm getting the end signal here. So unfortunately, we'll have to call it. I do have with me here, if you didn't get one of those articles, I've got some extras up here, and we'll have them. You can come forward and take one, and I'll just put it right out here. Other than that, I think that's it. So thank you very much.